the Florida sun, a relentless, burning eye in the vast, pale sky, beat down upon the asphalt of Highway 1. It baked the road until the tar shimmered, creating mirages of water that vanished as you drew near. The air, thick with humidity, hung heavy with the scent of pine resin, swamp water, and the faint, ever-present salt of the Atlantic, miles away. This was the Florida of the late 1980s and early 1990s, not the manicured fantasy of theme parks, but a sprawling, often lonely landscape of strip malls, truck stops, and long, lonely stretches of road connecting pockets of civilization. It was a place of transience where people passed through, their lives intersecting briefly at a gas pump, a diner counter, a roadside bar. It was a place where you could be seen by 100 people and known by none, and it was along these ribbons of concrete, under that unforgiving sun, that a story of profound tragedy and violence would unfold, a story that would forever be tied to the name Aileen Wuornos. She was a figure already familiar with the margins of this world long before the world learned her name. To the truckers and the bartenders, the waitresses and the motel clerks, she was just another face, another woman walking the shoulder of the highway, a solitary figure with a thumb out or a determined stride. She was, by trade, a prostitute. It was a profession born not of choice, but of a desperate, grinding necessity, the final, grim resort in a life that had been a catalogue of hardship from its very first breath. Aileen, who sometimes went by Lee or Cammy, was a creature of this highway ecosystem. She knew its rhythms, its dangers, its fleeting opportunities for a few dollars, a meal, a place to sleep. Her life on the road was a precarious existence. Days were spent navigating the blistering heat, trying to find a ride, a client, a moment of respite. Nights could be spent in cheap motels if business was good, or more often in the cramped confines of her beat-up car, or even under the dense, mosquito-ridden canopy of the Florida woods. It was a life of constant calculation and hypervigilance. Every car that slowed was a potential source of income, but also a potential threat. Every man who picked her up was a transaction, a negotiation where the currency was her body and her safety. She had learned to read the signs, to sense the shift in atmosphere from simple, sordid commerce to something more sinister. She carried with her a small, cheap revolver, a .22 caliber, a tool of her trade for intimidation as much as protection. It was a weight in her purse, a cold, metallic promise of consequence. During this time, her anchor, her one source of unwavering love and stability, was a woman named Tyria Moore. To Aileen, Tyria was everything. She was home. Their relationship was a private sanctuary in a public hell. In the small, cluttered apartments they occasionally shared, Aileen could, for a few precious hours, shed the hardened exterior the highway demanded. She could be vulnerable, affectionate. She could dream of a different life, a normal life, far away from the truck stops and the leering men. She would do anything for Tyria, work longer hours, face greater risks, absorb more humiliation, all to provide for them, to keep their fragile world intact. The money she earned on the road paid for their rent, their food, their cigarettes. It was a twisted, tragic form of devotion, a life of predation endured for the sake of love. But the pressure was immense, a constant, simmering fear that their tenuous security could be shattered in an instant by a bad client, a police raid, or simply a run of bad luck. The gun in her purse was not just for the men in the cars. It was for the protection of this one sacred thing in her life. It was the guarantor of the only love she had ever truly known. And as the summer of 1989 turned to autumn, and the oppressive heat gave way to a milder, but no less ominous, warmth, the balance in Aileen's world began to shift. The fear, the rage, the lifetime of betrayals and abuses that had been simmering just beneath the surface of her skin began to find a release valve. The first incident, the one that would set a terrible precedent, occurred on December 1, 1989. Though no one would know it for months, a man named Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater, picked her up. He was not the first, and he would not be the last, but he was the one who crossed a line in Aileen's mind, a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. In her telling, he was violent. He brutalized her. He triggered a survival instinct that was as feral and absolute as a cornered animal's. In that moment, the 22 in her purse was no longer a tool for intimidation. It became an instrument of finality. The transaction was no longer about money for sex. It was about her life for his. When it was over, Richard Mallory was dead in the woods off a dirt service road, and Aileen Wuornos had taken the first irreversible step from being a victim of the highway to becoming its most feared predator. She drove away in his car, later abandoning it. The weight of her actions, a new, heavier burden to carry back to the woman for whom she had done it all. I hope this first part of Aileen's story is drawing you into the somber, complex atmosphere of her world. If you're finding this narrative engaging, please show your support by giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into true crime's most haunting tales. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments below. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to see our community spanning the globe. The story continues, so make yourself comfortable and let's journey further down this dark road. of killing, Richard Mallory created a terrifying new paradigm for Aileen, a boundary once thought to be solid and immovable had proven to be terrifyingly fragile. The immediate, visceral terror of the event was soon overshadowed by a grim, practical reality. She had survived. More than that, she had taken control in the most absolute way possible. The man who, in her perception, had sought to annihilate her was gone, and she was still breathing, and with his death came a perverse form of compensation: his car, his possessions, a lump sum of cash that offered a temporary shield against the relentless pressure of poverty. In the distorted logic of her traumatized psyche, a connection was forged. Extreme threat could be met with extreme response, and that response could yield a reward that went beyond mere survival. It could provide a brief window of security for her and Tyria. This new, dark calculus settled deep within her. The world of the highway, already a landscape of potential danger, now became a theater of war where she was both the potential victim and the preemptive executioner. The hypervigilance she had always practiced curdled into a state of constant, hair-trigger anticipation. Every man who solicited her was no longer just a client. He was a potential Richard Mallory. The fear did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. But it was now coupled with a lethal resolution. The gun was no longer a last resort. It became a first and final argument. And so, the pattern repeated. The summer of 1990 became a killing season. On May 19, near Tampa, she encountered David Spears, a 43-year-old rodeo worker and laborer. The details of their interaction are lost to time, known only to Aileen and the dead man, but the outcome was the same. Spears was shot multiple times and left in a wooded area. Less than a month later, on June 1, the body of Charles Dick Humphreys, a 56-year-old former police chief and child abuse investigator from Alabama, was found near Pasco County. He had been shot 6 times. The connections between these men were not immediately apparent to the police investigating the scenes. They were found in different counties. Their backgrounds were diverse, and the investigations were handled by separate jurisdictions. The idea of a single serial killer, and a female one at that, was not yet on anyone's radar. They were tragic, isolated mysteries. But for Aileen, the isolation of the crimes was the point. Each event was a closed loop, a terrifying drama played out on a secluded stage of her choosing: a dirt road, a remote wooded area, a deserted construction site. She would get into a car, the transaction would be negotiated, and she would direct the driver to a place of isolation. Then, according to her later testimony, the scenario would often repeat: a threat a violent advance, a moment of sheer panic. She would fire and fire again until the threat was silenced. Then would come the grim aftermath, rifling through the man's wallet, taking his cash and valuables, sometimes driving his car for a while before abandoning it and making her way back to Tyria. The money would be presented as the proceeds of a good week, a successful run of dates. Tyria, who existed in a state of willful ignorance, battered by Aileen's volatile temper, and desperate for the stability the money provided, asked a few questions. The killings continued with a chilling rhythm. On July 4, the body of 50-year-old Troy Burress, a sausage company salesman, was discovered in Osceola National Forest. He had been shot twice on September 11. Another victim, 56-year-old Charles Dick Karskaden, a part-time truck driver and farmer from Missouri, was found in a remote part of Hernando County, shot multiple times. The final victim, 60-year-old Peter Seams, a missionary, vanished on his way from Florida to Arkansas in early June. His car, a battered, light blue Pontiac Sunbird, was the key. It was seen much later, being driven erratically by two women. Witnesses got a partial license plate number. The car and the women in it became the first tangible lead in a series of crimes that had, until then, been phantoms. The net, though no one knew it yet, was beginning to close. The solitary figure on the highway, who had been operating with a terrifying sense of impunity, was about to become the focus of one of the most intensive manhunts in Florida's history. The world she had built, a fragile house of cards propped up by violence and secrecy, was on the verge of collapse. The disappearance of Peter Seams and the subsequent sightings of his car marked a turning point. Unlike the other victims, who were found relatively quickly, Seams' body was never recovered. But his car was a tangible piece of evidence. The witness descriptions of the two women in the Pontiac Sunbird, one of whom matched the general description of the woman, sometimes seen hitchhiking on various stretches of highway, gave investigators their first real break. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement began to piece together the disparate murders. The use of a .22 caliber weapon, the similar modus operandi of the victims being lured to secluded areas, the fact that all the victims were middle-aged men, the outlines of a serial killer emerged, and the profile was shocking. It pointed to a woman. The abandoned Pontiac Sunbird was found on July 4, 1990, in Orange Springs. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints, but the very act of abandoning it created a geographical focal point. The investigation intensified, with police circulating composite sketches and flooding the highway areas with undercover officers. The pressure in Aileen and Tyria's world became unbearable. The money from the killings was gone, spent on rent, food, and their day-to-day survival. Aileen's behavior grew more erratic, more paranoid. The fear that had driven her to kill was now compounded by the fear of being caught. She and Tyria moved frequently, a step ahead of an invisible pursuer, their lives reduced to a frantic, nomadic existence, fueled by anxiety and dwindling resources. The breaking point came in January 1991. They were living in a seedy $29 a night room at the Fairview Motel in Daytona Beach. The money had run out completely, and the tension between them was a palpable, suffocating presence. Aileen, in a state of high agitation, knew the end was near. She confessed the broad outlines of the killings to Tyria, not as a boast, but as a desperate, tragic explanation for the terror that was closing in on them. She framed them as acts of self-defense, as the only way she could have survived, the only way she could have provided for them. For Tyria, the confession was a nightmare made real. The vague suspicions she had suppressed for months were now confirmed with brutal clarity. The love she felt for Aileen was suddenly entangled with the horror of her actions. Fearful of being implicated as an accessory, and under immense pressure from the reality of the situation, Tyria made a choice. She contacted her sister in Pennsylvania and arranged to leave Florida, to distance herself from the cataclysm that was Aileen Wuornos. Left alone in the motel room, Aileen was consumed by a profound and devastating despair. The one person for whom she had committed these terrible acts was gone. The structure of her world, which had been built entirely around her love for Tyria, crumbled into dust on January 9, 1991. She was arrested at the motel, not for murder, but for an outstanding warrant for firearms possession. It was a holding charge, a way to get her off the streets while the murder investigations solidified. But for Aileen, it was almost a relief. The running was over. The pretending was over. In her initial isolation in the Volusia County Jail, she was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions: defiance, self-pity, and a deep, aching loneliness. She had become the monster the headlines were now branding her. But in her own mind, she was still the victim, the one who had been fighting for her life over and over again on those lonely stretches of Florida highway. The final act of her story was about to begin, not on the asphalt, but in the cold, sterile confines of a courtroom. The tension is building as we approach the legal aftermath of Aileen's actions. If you're invested in seeing how this complex and tragic story concludes, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. I'd also love to hear more from our community. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And is it late at night or early morning for you? Your comments truly help build a connection across the miles. Now, let's move to the courtroom, where Aileen's fate would be decided. The sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the Volusia County Jail became the new stage for Aileen Wuornos. With her arrest on the minor charge, the real work for the investigators began. They now had in custody the woman they strongly believed was the highway hooker, the serial killer who had terrorized Florida's roadways. The evidence was circumstantial but mounting. Witness placements, ballistics were being matched, and most crucially, they had her connection to the abandoned Pontiac Sunbird. The interrogations were lengthy and intense. Aileen was initially defiant, angry, and combative. She portrayed herself as a victim of the system, of men, of a life that had given her nothing but hardship. She spoke of her clients in broad, condemning terms, painting them all with the same brush of potential violence. The detectives, skilled in the art of extraction, worked to break through her defenses. They presented her with pieces of evidence. They spoke of Tyria. They appealed to her desire to tell her side of the story. The facade of the hardened predator began to crack, revealing the terrified, traumatized woman beneath. The breakthrough came gradually. Exhausted, isolated, and perhaps seeing a twisted form of vindication in confession, she began to talk. She started with Richard Mallory, the first killing. She described it not as a murder, but as a righteous killing, an act of self-defense against a brutal rapist. She recounted the details with a chilling matter-of-factness. The fear and violence of the moment translated into a flat, narrative monotone. One by one, she moved through the list. Spears, Humphreys, Burress, Karskaden. With each confession, she built her case, a case not for her innocence, but for her justification. She was a soldier in a war against predatory men, and she had simply been defending her life, each and every time. The only victim she denied killing was Peter Seams, maintaining that story to the end. Her day in court arrived, and the spectacle began. The media descended, dubbing her the damsel of death, and America's first female serial killer. The courtroom became a theater where her life was dissected for public consumption. She stood before Judge Uriel Blount, a small, often disheveled figure in oversized jail clothes, a stark contrast to the monstrous image the headlines had created. Her demeanor shifted from day to day, sometimes attentive and calm, other times erupting in furious outbursts against the judge, the prosecutors, and the entire legal system she saw as corrupt and stacked against her. The state, represented by prosecutors John Tanner and David Damore, built a methodical, devastating case. They presented forensic evidence, ballistics experts who matched the .22 caliber bullets from each victim to her gun. They brought forth witnesses who placed her with the victims or near the crime scenes. They systematically dismantled her claims of self-defense, arguing that the execution-style nature of the killings, the theft of the victims' belongings, and the sheer number of incidents pointed not to panicked self-preservation, but to cold, premeditated murder for profit and spite. Her defense attorneys, initially trying to build a case based on mental incapacity and extreme emotional disturbance, found themselves battling their own client. Aileen was increasingly volatile and uncooperative. She fired her first set of attorneys, claiming they were part of the conspiracy against her. She wanted to represent herself, to use the courtroom as her platform, to proclaim her truth to the world. When that request was denied, she was assigned new counsel, but the pattern of conflict continued. She was determined to control her narrative, even if that narrative led directly to a guilty verdict and a death sentence. In her mind, she was not on trial for murder. The world was on trial for the life it had forced upon her. The trial for the murder of Richard Mallory proceeded with an air of inevitability. Aileen Wuornos took the stand in her own defense. It was a dramatic, chaotic, and ultimately self-destructive performance. For days, she held the courtroom in her thrall. She spoke not just of the killings, but of her entire life, the abandonment, the abuse, the prostitution, the relentless hardship. She wove a tapestry of victimhood so vast and so profound that the specific acts of violence seemed, to her, to be logical, inevitable outcomes. She described each of the men in graphic detail, portraying them as savage attackers who had left her no choice. Under cross-examination, however, her narrative began to fray. The prosecutors pressed her on the inconsistencies. Why did she never report these violent rapes to the police? Why did she always have the gun ready? Why did she rob them afterward? They painted a picture not of a panicked woman fighting for her life, but of a calculated predator who lured men to isolated locations, murdered them, and then financed her life with their possessions. They argued that her story of universal self-defense was a convenient fiction constructed after the fact, a final, desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The jury was presented with two starkly different portraits of the same woman. One was a victim of horrific circumstances who fought back with lethal force against her tormentors. The other was a ruthless killer who used her gender as a weapon of deception, preying on men who stopped to offer help, and then executing them in cold blood. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and the sheer number of killings made the claim of uniform self-defense seem statistically improbable and legally insupportable. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Richard Mallory. The penalty phase followed, a brief, grim proceeding that determined her fate. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, citing the heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the crimes, and the fact that they were committed during a robbery. The defense, in a last, futile effort, pleaded for mercy, speaking of her traumatic life and her diminished mental state. But Aileen herself seemed to welcome the ultimate punishment. She stood before the judge and declared, "I'm innocent. I was raped. I hope you get raped. Scumbags of America." On January 31, 1992, Judge Blount sentenced Aileen Wuornos to death by electrocution. The verdict and sentence were a form of closure for the state. But for Aileen, it was merely the transition to a new, more confined hell. She was moved to the Florida Department of Corrections death row, housed at the Broward Correctional Institution. Here, in a small concrete cell, she would spend the next decade, her body confined, but her mind racing through the past, trapped in an endless loop of trauma, rage, and a deepening psychosis. The world outside moved on, but for Aileen Wuornos, time was now measured in appeals, stays of execution, and the slow, inexorable march towards the execution chamber. The transition from the volatile spectacle of the courtroom to the stark, monotonous reality of death row was a seismic shift for Aileen Wuornos. She was now inmate number 67,404, a number replacing a name, a unit in a system designed for containment and eventual termination. Her new world was a small, sterile cell, a concrete and steel box that measured time in the echoes of slamming doors, the shuffling of guards' feet, and the faint, distant sounds of a life she would never again be part of. The vast, open highways she had once roamed were replaced by a claustrophobic horizon of bars and cinder block. In this new, rigidly controlled environment, the facets of her personality that had been weaponized on the outside, the rage, the defiance, the paranoia, had no outlet but to turn inward. The initial years were marked by a continuous, often chaotic, legal battle. She appealed her conviction and sentence, a process that dragged on through the courts, offering fleeting glimpses of hope that were invariably dashed. She corresponded sporadically with journalists and activists, some of whom saw her as a symbol of a failed system, a victim of lifelong abuse who had finally snapped. In these letters, her handwriting often betraying her agitated state, she vacillated between lucid, detailed accounts of her childhood and fantastical claims of conspiracies, of being targeted by a nationwide hit squad of police and Johns. Her relationship with the outside world became increasingly filtered through this lens of psychosis. She fired her appellate lawyers, accusing them of working against her. She gave televised interviews from prison, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and desperation, where she reiterated her claims of self-defense, but also began to express a desire for the state to get it over with. The fight was draining from her, replaced by a profound weariness and a deepening mental disintegration. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and was likely suffering from severe PTSD, conditions that had gone untreated and unacknowledged for her entire life, and which were now festering in the isolation of her cell. During this period, she began to recant her claims of self-defense. In a series of statements and letters, she claimed that her original stories of rape and torture were a complete lie. She admitted that she had killed the men in cold blood, robbing them to get money for herself and Tyria. "I robbed them, and I killed them," she stated with a chilling finality. Her motivation for this confession was complex. Part of it seemed to be a final act of control, a way to seize the narrative back from the courts and the media. By admitting to murder, she was, in her twisted logic, proving the system correct, and thus hastening her own execution, which she now claimed to want. It was an act of ultimate self-destruction, a final, furious rejection of a world that had, from the very beginning, rejected her. As the years passed, the legal avenues began to close. One by one, each appeal was filed, considered, and denied. The machinery of the death penalty, slow and deliberate, ground forward. Aileen's physical health began to deteriorate alongside her mental state. The vibrant, if hardened, woman from the roadside was gone, replaced by a gaunt, aging figure who spent her days in a fog of medication and paranoia. She claimed to have been poisoned, to be the victim of ongoing harassment by guards, her mind constructing elaborate persecutions that mirrored the very real persecution of the state seeking her death. In 2001, with her appeals nearly exhausted, she formally waived her right to any further legal challenges. She demanded that the state of Florida carry out her sentence. This was an unprecedented move, a conscious acceleration towards death. Her lawyers and mental health experts argued that she was not competent to make such a decision, that a person suffering from profound psychosis could not rationally choose to be executed. This sparked a final, macabre legal battle. Was Aileen Wuornos sane enough to be put to death? The courts ordered psychiatric evaluations. The doctors who examined her found a woman deeply ill, consumed by delusions, yet who understood the nature of the death penalty and the reason it was being imposed upon her. This narrow definition of competency was enough for the legal system. The judge ruled that she was, indeed, competent to fire her lawyers and accept her fate. It was a legal and ethical gray area, the final, tragic paradox of her life, her mental illness, which had played such a crucial role in driving her to murder, was now deemed not severe enough to save her from the ultimate punishment for those murders. With the last administrative hurdle cleared, a date was set, October 9, 2002. The execution would be carried out by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. The news seemed to bring a strange sense of calm to Aileen. The waiting, the endless legal limbo, was finally over. She began to speak of her impending death not with fear, but with a sense of relief, as a release from the pain of her existence. She saw it as a form of freedom, the only kind left available to her. In her final days, she granted a last interview, stating, "I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be rockin' soon. I'll be free from all this pain and torture." The woman who had fought so violently to control her life was now, in the most extreme way possible, taking control of her death. The final weeks of Aileen Wuornos' life were a study in grim ritual and psychological unraveling. Transferred from her death row cell to the Florida State Prison, she was placed in a special cell near the execution chamber, a space known as Death Watch. Here, every movement, every meal, every visit was logged and monitored under a microscope of procedure. The chaotic fury that had characterized much of her life seemed to have burned away, leaving behind a residue of eerie resignation and deepening psychosis. She spent her days in the sterile, fluorescent-lit cell, her world reduced to a few square meters. The countdown to her death, measured in sunrises, she could no longer see. She was permitted a few final visits. She spoke with a spiritual advisor, though she had long rejected organized religion, viewing it as another hypocritical arm of the system that condemned her. Her conversations were a fragmented mix of lucid statements about her desire for the pain to end and rambling, paranoid accusations. She claimed her body was deteriorating due to forced radiation exposure, that she was being slowly murdered before the execution. These were the desperate constructs of a mind that had been fractured by a lifetime of trauma and was now shattering under the weight of its own imminent annihilation. In her final statement, written and released to the press, she offered no apology to the families of her victims, no expression of remorse. Instead, it was a final, defiant blast of rage. She spoke of the political reasons for her execution, of being raped and tortured by the system in Florida. She ended with a chilling declaration, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. It was a statement that perfectly encapsulated her end, a blend of pop culture references, messianic delusion, and a lifetime of perceived persecution, all pointing toward a violent, cinematic return that would never come. On the morning of October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was awakened for the last time. The protocol was followed with a chilling precision. She was offered a final meal, but refused it, stating she only wanted a cup of coffee. After the last-minute appeals were denied, the preparations began. She was dressed in a loose-fitting gown and escorted the short distance from her cell to the execution chamber. The witness room was divided. On one side, representatives of the state and a few media witnesses. On the other, the families of her victims, there to see the conclusion of a nightmare that had haunted them for over a decade. They looked through a pane of glass at the gurney, where Aileen was now being secured by guards, her arms strapped down to the boards, the intravenous lines being inserted into her veins. She appeared frail, almost small, a stark contrast to the monstrous figure of the headlines. When asked if she had any final words, she did not look at the witnesses or the families. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling, or perhaps on something beyond it. Her voice was steady, but the words were the same delusional refrain. I'd like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6, like the movie. I'll be back, she repeated. It was not an apology, not a moment of clarity, but a final, unwavering commitment to the narrative she had built in her mind. The chemicals began to flow, the sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, the pancuronium bromide to paralyze her muscles and stop her breathing, the potassium chloride to stop her heart. There was no struggle, no dramatic final breath. At 9:47 a.m., a physician pronounced Aileen Wuornos dead. The life that had begun in abandonment and wound its way through abuse, prostitution, violence, and national infamy was over. The state of Florida had concluded its transaction. The death of Aileen Wuornos did not bring closure. It merely solidified her status as a complex and troubling icon for the families of the victims. It was the end of a legal battle, but not an erasure of their grief. Their loved ones were still gone, their lives brutally cut short. The debate around her case, however, only intensified. Was she a cold-blooded monster who exploited the trust of men to rob and kill them? Or was she a profoundly damaged product of a society that had failed her at every turn? A woman whose actions, while heinous, were the predictable outcome of a life spent in the abyss. Her story forced an uncomfortable examination of the American justice system's treatment of women. particularly those from the most marginalized fringes of society. It raised questions about the death penalty and mental competency. It became a lens through which to view the hidden world of violence against sex workers and the desperate measures taken for survival. She became a subject of documentaries, books, and a major Hollywood film, often reduced to a caricature, either a feminist avenger or a pathological fiend. But the true legacy of Aileen Wuornos is not found in these simplifications. It is found in the unbearable weight of a single, tragic life. It is a story that stretches from a childhood of being thrown away, through a youth of brutalization, to an adulthood of predation and eventual state-sanctioned death. There are no heroes in this story, only victims. The men who were murdered, and the woman who, long before she ever pulled a trigger, was a victim of a fate so cruel that violence became her only language. Her life stands as a dark monument to the fact that some tragedies are so complete, so absolute, that there is no redemption to be found, only a long, quiet echo of suffering that continues long after the final breath is drawn. In the years following the execution, the figure of Aileen Wuornos did not fade into the quiet annals of true crime history, but instead grew more complex, a Rorschach test for societal anxieties about gender, violence, and justice. The official record was clear. She was a serial killer who confessed to her crimes and was lawfully executed. Yet, the human desire to understand the why ensured that her case remained open for debate, a subject of endless analysis. One of the most persistent questions revolves around the veracity of her final confession. After years of vehemently claiming self-defense, why did she recant? Was it, as she claimed, a moment of stark clarity and a desire to unburden her soul before God? Or was it the final act of a profoundly mentally ill woman, seeking to control her narrative by embracing the monster role the world had assigned to her? Some legal scholars and psychologists argue that her recantation was unreliable, the product of a deteriorated psyche, no longer capable of distinguishing truth from the destructive narratives she had constructed for survival. Others take it at face value, seeing it as the one honest moment in a lifetime of deception. The truth likely lies in a painful gray area, a mixture of genuine remorse, a desire to end the legal torment, and the ravages of severe mental illness. Furthermore, the role of her childhood trauma became a central point of contention. While the prosecution successfully argued that a difficult past could not excuse cold-blooded murder, defense experts and subsequent commentators insisted it was not an excuse, but an explanation. The relentless abuse, the sexual violence, the homelessness, and the institutional neglect she suffered from infancy created a person for whom the world was a perpetually hostile place. Her perception of constant threat, whether real or imagined, became the lens through which she viewed every interaction. This does not absolve her of responsibility, but it frames her actions not as those of a born predator, but as the tragic, violent endpoint of a soul systematically broken from its earliest days. The trial itself also came under scrutiny. Were her outbursts and her conflict with her attorneys the actions of a manipulative defendant, or the symptoms of her illnesses making it impossible for her to participate meaningfully in her own defense? The legal system, built on the premise of a rational actor, struggled to contain the reality of Aileen Wuornos. Her case highlighted the tension between the law's black and white definitions of competency and the messy, shaded reality of profound psychological disturbance. Part 12. Echoes in Culture and Conscience. Aileen Wuornos' story proved to be irresistibly compelling for filmmakers and artists, all seeking to capture some essence of her tragedy. The most famous of these, the 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron, achieved critical acclaim for its brutal portrayal. Yet, like all adaptations, it necessarily simplified. It focused heavily on her relationship with Selby Wall, a fictional stand-in for Tyria Moore, and the initial descent into violence, culminating in the first killing. The long, grim years on death row, the psychological disintegration, and the complex legal battles were largely omitted in favor of a more streamlined narrative. The film and other documentaries cemented a certain image of her in the public consciousness, but they also performed a crucial, if unintended, function. They sparked a broader public conversation about the very issues that defined her life. People who had never considered the plight of women in the sex trade began to learn about the endemic violence they face. Discussions about the death penalty and mental illness were brought to the fore. She became an uncomfortable symbol, forcing a reckoning with the idea that monsters are not born, but made, forged in the crucible of poverty, abuse, and societal indifference. For every person who saw her as an irredeemable killer, another saw a stark example of a system that fails its most vulnerable members at every stage. From childhood protection services to the mental health infrastructure to the finality of the death chamber, her life story stands as a cautionary tale about what can happen when a human being is treated as disposable. The violence she inflicted was horrific and undeniable, but it was also a reflection of the violence that had been inflicted upon her, a distorted echo that finally demanded the world listen, even if it was only to condemn her. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos is not a single lesson, but a series of uncomfortable, unresolved questions. It asks us to consider the limits of human endurance, the nature of evil, and the responsibilities of a society toward its outcasts. Her name endures not because the answers are clear, but because the questions she raises about pain, justice, and redemption are ultimately unanswerable. Her story is a wound that never fully heals, a dark star in the constellation of American crime whose light, however dim and disturbing, continues to flicker in the decades since her death. The story of Aileen Wuornos has transcended the realm of true crime to become a dark, enduring industry. Documentaries have been produced, each claiming to offer a new perspective or previously unseen footage. Academics in fields of criminology, sociology, and gender studies have dissected her life, publishing papers that analyze her as a case study in gendered violence or the failure of the social safety net. Online forums dedicated to true crime enthusiasts are filled with threads debating the minutiae of her case, from the ballistics evidence to the credibility of her final confession. Her name and likeness have become shorthand for a specific kind of archetypal female killer, not the poisoner or the Black Widow, but the brutal, confrontational murderer who shattered stereotypes. This commodification of her tragedy raises ethical questions. The victims' families have had to watch as the person who destroyed their lives is transformed into a subject of macabre fascination. And even in some corners, a perverse icon. The complexity of her humanity is often flattened into a simple, consumable product: the monster. The very real pain at the heart of the story, the lives lost, the trauma endured, can be overshadowed by the spectacle. The endless replay of her angry courtroom outbursts and her paranoid interviews from death row can have a desensitizing effect, reducing a profound human catastrophe to a form of entertainment. The woman who felt used her entire life became, in death, used once more, her image and story repackaged for public consumption. Part 14. The Archetype and the Aftermath. Aileen Wuornos fundamentally challenged the cultural script of female criminality. Before her, the most notorious female serial killers often operated in the domestic sphere. Nurses like Beverly Allett or angels of death like Jenny Jones. They used stealth and their positions of trust. Wuornos was different. Her violence was direct, messy, and occurred in the public, masculine domain of the open road. She didn't fit the mold, and this dissonance made her both fascinating and terrifying to the public. Her case also forced a lingering look at the legal defense of self-defense in situations of sexual violence. While the jury in her case ultimately rejected the argument, it highlighted the immense difficulty of proving such a claim, especially for a woman with her history and profession. The perfect victim is a quiet, respectable, and relatable figure. Aileen Wuornos was none of those things. Her defense was hampered not just by the evidence, but by her own identity, which was at odds with what society expects a victim to look like. The aftermath for the key figures in her life was varied and often tragic. Tyria Moore, who was granted immunity for her testimony, changed her name and disappeared from public view, presumably living a life forever shadowed by her connection to the murders. The families of the victims were left with a hollow victory. The execution brought no one back. The debate over the death penalty and mental illness that her case so prominently featured continues to rage without resolution, and Aileen Wuornos herself was laid to rest, her ashes reportedly scattered in her native Michigan, a final return to a state that had offered her little comfort in life. Her grave, unmarked, stands in stark contrast to the indelible mark she left on the cultural landscape. A silent end to a life defined by noise, violence, and a desperate, unanswered cry for a salvation that never came. The story of Aileen Wuornos does not conclude with the cessation of her heartbeat or the scattering of her ashes. It persists, a ghost in the machine of modern culture, and an uncomfortable stain on the idealized portrait of American justice. Her narrative became a foundational stone in the architecture of the true crime genre, which evolved from sensationalized pulp paperbacks into a multi-billion-dollar industry of podcasts, streaming series, and dedicated online communities. Within this ecosystem, her life is often picked apart, not with the clinical distance of a historian, but with the fervent curiosity of an audience seeking to understand the anatomy of a monster. This ongoing dissection, while fostering a certain awareness of the complex roots of violence, also runs the risk of transforming profound human suffering into a consumable product, a dark fairy tale for adults. Her case established a blueprint, a set of tropes that would be applied to subsequent female offenders who defied easy categorization. The media, having learned from the Wuornos phenomenon, now often seeks the why with greater urgency, digging into backgrounds with a voyeuristic zeal. The public, in turn, has become more adept at holding two conflicting truths in their minds: that a person can be both a perpetrator of heinous acts and a victim of catastrophic circumstances. This nuanced, if often messy, understanding is part of her enduring legacy. She forced a conversation that extended beyond the courtroom into living rooms and academic halls about the very nature of guilt, victimhood, and the possibility of redemption for someone deemed Irredeemable, Part 16. A reflection in a broken mirror. To look at the life of Aileen Wuornos is to gaze into a broken mirror, reflecting a distorted image of society itself. The cracks in the glass represent the failures that defined her existence. The child protection services that failed to protect her, the family that cast her out, the economic systems that offered her no legitimate path, and the mental health institutions that never intervened. The reflection it casts is not a flattering one. It shows a world where individuals can fall through the gaps, becoming so damaged and isolated that violence appears as the only logical language left to speak. Her story serves as a permanent cautionary tale, but its moral is frustratingly ambiguous. Is the lesson that early intervention and robust social support could prevent such tragedies, or is it a darker reminder that some human beings, once broken past a certain point, are beyond repair, their trajectory toward destruction seemingly preordained? There is no clean resolution, no satisfying answer that neatly ties the narrative together. The families of her victims deserve justice, and they received it in the eyes of the law. Yet the execution of a severely traumatized and mentally ill woman leaves a moral aftertaste that justice alone cannot cleanse. Aileen Wuornos remains an enigma, a figure of immense pathos and terrifying violence. Her name is now a symbol, forever tied to the lonesome highways, the grim transaction of a life for a life, and the haunting question of where the line between a victim and a monster truly lies. The final silence that followed her death did not provide an answer. It only cemented the echo of the question, which continues to resonate, a low, unsettling hum beneath the surface of our collective consciousness, as persistent and unyielding as the memory of the woman who was, from the very beginning, left by the side of the road. Beyond the legal proceedings and the cultural phenomenon lies the enduring endeavor to understand Aileen Wuornos through a psychological lens, a post-mortem examination of a mind in perpetual crisis. Psychiatrists and criminologists, armed with the detailed records of her life and her own rambling testimonies, have pieced together a portrait of a personality shattered by borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder, all compounded by decades of substance abuse. These were not mere labels, but the operating system of her chaos. The core feature of borderline personality disorder, a pervasive fear of abandonment, manifested in her desperate, all-consuming relationship with Tyria Moore. The thought of losing Tyria was not just an emotional blow. It triggered an existential panic that mirrored the abandonment she experienced as a child. This fear was the engine of her criminal activity, the need to provide for Tyria, to secure her love and presence, justified any means necessary in her distorted logic. The antisocial traits, the deceit, the impulsivity, the disregard for the safety of others, were the tools she used to navigate a world she perceived as universally hostile. Her PTSD meant she was not just living in a dangerous present. She was constantly reliving the violent traumas of her past. Every client in a car became a reincarnation of the men who had abused her. Every perceived slight a trigger for a survival response that was catastrophically disproportionate. This psychological cocktail made her an unreliable narrator of her own life. Her statements, both her claims of self-defense and her later confessions of cold-blooded murder, cannot be taken at pure face value. They were products of a psyche that constructed narratives to make sense of its own unbearable reality. When she claimed self-defense, she may have genuinely believed it in that moment. Her perception so warped by past trauma that she saw mortal threat where there may have been none. When she recanted, it could be seen as a final, dramatic act of self-sabotage, a way to confirm her own monstrousness, and thus justify the punishment she felt she deserved. A punishment that was, perversely, a form of the attention and finality she craved. Part 18. The unforgotten, the unforgiven. The passage of time has not softened the polarities of her story. In the digital age, her memory is kept alive in 1,000 different corners of the internet. On one hand, there are memorial pages that speak of her as a tragic figure, a symbol of a misogynistic system that creates and then destroys its most damaged women. These spaces often focus on her victimhood, highlighting the abuse of her childhood and the exploitation she faced as a sex worker, framing her killings as a flawed but understandable rebellion against patriarchal violence. On the other hand, in forums and comment sections, she is routinely depicted as a subhuman monster, an evil aberration whose childhood is no excuse for her sadism. Here, the focus remains exclusively on the 7 men left dead on the roadside, their stories often reduced to footnotes in the saga of their killer. This dichotomy reflects our collective inability to reconcile the two halves of her existence, the brutalized child and the brutal adult. We are compelled to choose a side, to see her either as a victim or a villain, because holding both truths simultaneously is a psychological burden too heavy to bear. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that humanity is not a binary of good and evil, but a spectrum upon which a person can occupy the most extreme and contradictory points. The families of the victims continue to grapple with this duality. For them, The ongoing public fascination with Wuornos can feel like a secondary victimization. While the world debates her psyche and her legacy, they mourn individuals, fathers, brothers, sons, whose lives have been overshadowed by the notoriety of their murderer. The complexity of her background offers them no solace, only a painful reminder that their loved ones were casualties in a war they knew nothing about. A war that began long before Aileen Wuornos ever set foot on a Florida highway. For them, she is, and can only ever be, the monster. Any other interpretation feels like a betrayal of the lives she erased. Today, the ghost of Aileen Wuornos haunts more than just true crime forums. She appears in academic seminars on criminology, in policy discussions about sex worker safety, and in ethical debates surrounding the death penalty and mental illness. Her case is a perennial reference point, a dark star by which other similar tragedies are often navigated. When a woman commits an act of extreme violence, the question, is she another Wuornos, often hangs in the air, a testament to how thoroughly her story has rewritten the cultural script for female violence. Her narrative forces a persistent, uncomfortable introspection. It asks us to look at the people existing on the absolute margins of our society and consider the potential for catastrophe that festers there. It challenges the comforting notion that monsters are born, not made, suggesting instead that they are meticulously constructed through neglect, abuse, and societal indifference. The story of Aileen Wuornos is, in its entirety, a profound human tragedy. It is the story of a life that was met with violence at every turn, violence that she eventually learned to reflect back upon the world with devastating force. There are no lessons here that offer comfort, only a chilling reminder of the depths of human suffering and the terrible forms it can sometimes take. Her echo is a warning that refuses to fade, a whisper from the roadside that tells us that some roads, once taken, lead only into an endless, consuming dark. And so, as the final echoes of that turbulent story fade, let us gently release them. Allow the weight of those words to dissipate, like mist yielding to the morning sun. Bring your awareness back to this moment, to the quiet of your own space. Feel the gentle support of the surface beneath you. Notice the soft rhythm of your own breathing, the effortless inhale that nourishes your body, and the slow, releasing exhale that lets go of all tension. With each breath out, imagine any lingering thoughts, any traces of the outside world simply floating away. Listen to the silence around you, or perhaps to the faint, familiar sounds of your home, the gentle hum of an appliance, the distant whisper of the wind outside your window. These are the sounds of peace, the anchors of the present moment. Visualize a still, serene lake at dusk, the water is perfectly calm, its surface a mirror for the soft, fading colors of the sky. There is no wind, not a single ripple. Watch as the first stars begin to appear, their reflections glimmering softly on the water's dark surface. Any thoughts that arise are like lone, weightless leaves, slowly drifting down to rest upon this tranquil water, causing no disturbance before sinking gently into the deep, quiet stillness. Your mind is becoming like that lake, calm, clear, and deeply peaceful. There is no past to dwell upon, no future to plan for. There is only this quiet moment, this gentle darkness, this soothing stillness. Your body is heavy and relaxed. Your mind is at ease. You are safe. You are still. You are at peace. Let this deep tranquility cradle you as you drift towards rest.